With the release of Thrawn's Revenge 3.2, there's plenty of new content to explore whether you're new to the mods or have been playing for years. And in this guide I'll be showing you how to get the most out of a new and unique playable faction, the Hapes Consortium. Or alternatively, let you know how to best play against them. Their small frigate focus, to the exclusion of larger capital ships, along with their position in the galaxy, makes them have a lot of new angles for players which can be tricky to nail down, but once mastered can be incredibly powerful. We'll be going over their whole space and ground roster, government mechanics, and some basic tips on how to succeed as this matriarchal monarchy. For an overview on less faction-specific mod mechanics, please check out the Beginner's Guide to Thrawn's Revenge video linked in the cards and from the playlist in the video description. Aside from one or two new heroes as the eras progress, the Hapans space and ground roster are both consistent throughout the game in 3.2, so you don't need to worry about era interactions for how you should build your fleets just yet with this faction, though there is already some future content planned to expand it in the next releases. The Hapans are very defensively focused compared to other factions, with a few defensive bonuses not available to other factions. For one thing, Hapans' secondary defenses can be the same level as their main starbase, except at level 5. So where most factions can only build a Golan 1 to support a Golan 2, for example, the Hapan Meridian starbases can be paired at the same level. Hapan shipyards also only exist at one level, so they can build any of their ships on any planet, without having to worry about shipyard levels. To make up for the difference in garrisons from this, Hapan level 4 and 5 stations come with additional defensive garrisons. So for Hapans, the starbase level available at a planet is far more important than shipyard levels. While this means you can build any ship at any planet, each individual ship does build slower compared to other factions. These factors all put together make the Hapans perfect for any player looking for a turtling faction. The core of the Hapan space roster is built around the rather versatile cannon backbones to the Hapan fleet, the Battle Dragon and the Nova Cruiser. The Hapan Battle Dragon is going to be common in any Hapan fleet. They have a good mix of medium turbo lasers and ion cannons, as well as some proton torpedoes and a reasonable amount of fighters and bombers. While its firepower is entirely concentrated on individual, very high fire rate weapons, which can only hit a single target, it does also have the ability to sacrifice some of its accuracy for more spread out fire to engage multiple targets at once through an ability. This targeting swap ability can be toggled at any time. The Nova Cruiser comes in two varieties, a light carrier and a more combat-centric variant. The carrier version has light turbo lasers, medium ion cannons, and rapid heavy lasers, and a squadron of each fighters and bombers. They also have some light point defense from rapid heavy lasers, meaning they're able to protect themselves and your fleet from enemy bombers, provide significant fighter and bomber support when used in numbers, and deal with smaller enemy threats. The combat refit loses some of the fighter support and all of the bombers, but switches the light turbo lasers for more powerful mediums. You'll usually want to build your fleets by starting with 4 to 5 Battle Dragons and about twice as many Nova Cruisers. Once you have this core, the Hapans currently have 12 other more specialized units to fill out your fleet depending on what you're going to be fighting with it. We'll start with the tanky Coronal class Fleet Tender. Fleet Tenders are able to passively repair units in a battle, and as a faction with most of its units having no targetable hardpoints, Hapans are able to benefit immensely from having one or two of these around. Once a hardpoint is dead, it can't be restored, but everything up to the Battle Dragon class can therefore be kept up to full health by proper tender use. Placing a coronal with each battle group and keeping it out of danger, though it can take a fair bit of punishment itself, can add a ton of effective HP to a fleet that otherwise contains ships which are vulnerable when focused. They also have the ability to deploy interdiction mines, which prevent the enemy from retreating. Coronals can be found on the capital ship menu. Sticking with the other ships in the Hapan roster found on the capital menu, which still aren't very large, we'll start by covering the Neutron, the Mist, and the Terraphon. The Neutron class is the Hapan's heavy brawler. Its mix of proton torpedoes, heavy ion cannons, and heavy turbo lasers make it perfect for taking on enemy capital ships, even at long ranges if needed, while it has a very respectable hull and shield pool for its size. Its power to shields ability makes it perfect for when you need a ship to take some heat for your battle dragons while they do the real damage. The Neutron can usually eat up an initial engagement while other ships take out the threats, though they're not great at taking out smaller enemy ships themselves. The Ancient Mist class is similarly fairly tanky, edging the Neutron out in hull, though it lacks the power to shields ability. It's not intended for direct combat itself, instead serving as a dedicated large carrier. Its medium turbo lasers and quad lasers make it able to defend itself if needed, but it's primarily going to be how you access deeper fighter reserves for the Hapans, which is not usually present on their other carriers even. Finally, we have the Thrawn class, which is able to provide DPS against basically any type of target you need taken down, with a mix of some medium ions, though less than most other Hapan ships, turbo lasers, proton torpedoes, and heavy laser cannons. It lacks the raw ion power of the battle dragons as well as its fighter complement, so it's less flexible than some of these other options, especially the battle dragon, but having one or two to help clear out targets whose shields have been stripped by the many other ion sources in the fleet will always be helpful. One step down in size from these options, in the 600 meter-ish range, we have two more ships, the Pulsar and the Magnetar. The Pulsar is a dedicated heavy ion boat. While it does have triple light turbo lasers to get in some hull damage, these are usually going to be out of range, as its primary use is its triple heavy ion cannons, which allow it to sit back behind the rest of your fleet and tear through the shields of enemy capital ships and especially battle cruisers. You get a huge amount of relatively safe ion cannon DPS against these otherwise threatening targets, though with their ion focus you will need something else like a Thrawn or Battle Dragon for the follow-up on these hardpoints. The Magnetar also fills that role of follow-up damage, as a carrier which has a heavy focus on its own assault concussion missile launchers as well. These do AoE damage and are great at hitting such larger targets. The mix of bombers and assault concussion missiles from these make them really good sources of high-impact, upfront alpha strikes, though it does make them especially vulnerable to being shut down by corvette fleets with their access to point defense and anti-fighter weaponry. Next up, we have two ships which are one step down in size but are the final direct combat elements of the Hapan roster, and break away from the punching up that most Hapan ships have done so far, the Cheruba and Olanji frigates. So far, most of what we talked about is how to take down the bigger targets in enemy fleets, but how do you effectively kill the smaller targets other than Nova cruisers? Medium weaponry on battle dragons and Terraforms can still be good against them, but if you really need to rip apart a group of corvettes or smaller frigates, and you will with the CSA and Greater Maldru nearby, these are going to be some of your go-to options. Both have light dual turbo lasers and light ion cannons, and the Cheruba is fairly tanky, especially compared to the Olanji, but both also have their own secondary weapon focus, allowing them to specialize from each other as well as provide damage against larger targets, especially the Olanji, which has a large loadout of proton torpedoes compared to the Cheruba, which has medium turbo lasers. With this difference, when you're dealing with specifically anti-fighter corvettes, the Olanji will be less effective because the point defense will be able to handle the proton torpedoes. You'll always want to keep at least a couple of these in your fleets to deal with corvette or light frigate hunting while the rest of your fleet deals with other threats, but this is going to be especially true when dealing with frigate-heavy fleets or factions. The final three small frigates of the Hapan roster fill a variety of support roles. First is the Beta, which acts in some ways as an even more specialized pulsar. Its main weapons are ultra-heavy ion cannons, which is the longest range weapon class available to the faction, allowing them to set even further back and tear apart station or capital shields with ease, though they similarly need other help to take down the hull afterwards. The Stella is a small carrier which invests more heavily in its fighters than its direct combat abilities compared to the Nova. Heavy turbo lasers do allow it to contribute to anti-ship damage from afar, though it's far less capable against defending itself against pretty much any other one-on-one threat. Finally, we have the Bidem class corvette, the standard Hapan anti-fighter ship. These provide decent anti-fighter power and some point defense to take care of incoming missiles, but are not quite the same level as ships like the Tartan or Lancer in either category, so you'll always want a few, but this factor also contributes to the Hapan fighters and bombers being used a bit differently than in a lot of other factions. One other thing to remember with Hapans is that while they don't have large capital ships themselves, you can still incorporate a few into your fleets via boarding, which Hapans did extensively in-universe. You can build the expensive but reusable boarding shuttles and capture ships with the boardable tag in battle, usually anything below 2200 meters. You do this by maneuvering your boarding shuttle close to your intended target and then clicking the ability. The lower the target health, the higher the chance of success. On many maps, you'll also start next door to Mandalore, whose independent forces include several boardable Kadabes. Hapan fighter variety is currently low as this is the faction's first playable release, so you currently only have the Mytil fighter and bomber, which still tend to come in relatively high numbers overall. While between the Battle Dragon, Nova Cruiser, Stella, Magnetar, and Mist, you have a wide variety of carrier options, a lot of these don't have high reserves. Your upfront numbers of each type can be high, but with those few reserves, if they die you'll definitely miss them, so trying to focus on them for your damage is going to be riskier. Instead, you'll want to keep your fighters back to protect your ships, and use your bombers to focus down nearby enemy ships that are getting too close. With their small size and lower than average accuracy, Hapan ships will excel at hitting larger targets from afar while being missed themselves. You will struggle with hitting the smaller ships at a range, at least at first. After your battle dragons tear up the larger targets, your fleet can move in to take any of those smaller frigates remaining, or you can use Tarubas and Alangis or even Novas to try to pick away at a few of them from the edges of enemy forces at the start of the battle. The bombers can also be used to quickly take down defensive emplacements. While having smaller ships like this can seem a bit daunting at first, because it can require more micromanagement to keep them safe and give the faction a higher skill floor for new players, once you're comfortable enough to give each ship, especially individual targeting orders, you can even pause the game if you have to while doing this, you can often get even better returns on your micromanagement investment than with other factions. A single Imperial Star Destroyer, while it has more raw power and more survivability, can only target one hardpoint on an enemy ship at once. But the same pop cap worth of smaller frigates can each hit a different hardpoint at the same time, for example. You'll also be less likely to lose out on fleet effectiveness as ships lose individual hardpoints. Mixing these capabilities with good use of fleet tenders can yield some fantastic results. Usually, I cover the space and ground rosters before the government mechanics in these guides, but for the Hapans we'll be talking about the government mechanics before the ground roster. The Hapan government mechanics are relatively simple on their first iteration, but are built around building favor with different Hapan royal houses. The Hapans are ruled by a queen, Ta Chum, who has a fantastic price discount on top of commanding a unique ship larger than any other ship they have, serving as a giant fleet tender called the Star Home. Definitely use that economic bonus as much as you can, it's a significant bonus, and she can be quickly moved around the very close starting planets you have in order to get discounts on almost everything you build early in the campaign. But on top of the main royal family, there are other royal houses in the consortium. Currently there are 3, being Galni, Maluri, and Rakud. Each royal house has its own shipyard structure and government building. You can only build 1 shipyard and 1 government building on each planet, but by building anything on a planet that has either of those structures belonging to a family, you'll gain favor with that family. Once you have 50 favor, you unlock the ability to build a house commander from that house, giving you access to extra heroes on top of the main roster of heroes you start with. While ship options don't change per family shipyard, on the ground the barracks on each planet will have different specialized infantry types depending on which family rules the planet or which family's government building is there. So we'll move on now to the ground section. On the ground, the Hapan roster is very infantry focused, with their vehicles being oriented around quick infantry support and transport as well as map mobility. Every Hapan vehicle is either a repulsor tank or aerial, allowing them to traverse terrain more easily than other factions. For their infantry, the main royal house building allows the recruitment of a commando squad equipped with snipers, grenades, and repeaters, making them great at engaging enemy infantry, though less numerous than other options. They also get the standard Royal Guard infantry, which are your typical versatile infantry type, equipped with a mix of anti-infantry light repeaters, ion cannons and rifles, along with anti-vehicle laser cannons. Usually infantry have rockets for anti-vehicle, so make sure you don't sleep on the anti-vehicle capabilities of these infantry just because you don't see the smoke trails. House Galni's infantry squads are these specialized anti-infantry squads without anti-vehicle weapons. House Maluri are the support squads, meaning they have specialists able to heal other infantry or repair vehicles. And finally, House Rakud is specialized in anti-vehicle, with their forces armed with anti-tank, proton missiles, and rifles. There are at least 3 other houses planned to join with their own unique options in the upcoming releases, so if you're playing in one of those releases, those might be available as well, just make sure you check in-game. For vehicles, the Hapans have 2 primary combat speeders, the Water Dragon and the Fire Dragon. The Water Dragon is the smaller of the 2, geared towards anti-infantry, while the Fire Dragon is larger, has some anti-infantry cannons, but is primarily used for anti-vehicle duty. Each of these can operate independently, but for large engagements is best used in coordination with the varied infantry types the Hapans have access to. A second variation on the smaller Water Dragon is the Hapan Parallax artillery. It's pretty mobile, though more fragile than other factions' artillery. For their final repulsor tank, we have the Rana APC, an infantry transport with its own mix of anti-infantry guns and supportive infantry healing abilities, acting basically like a ground coronal for the infantry battle dragons. Keeping infantry around these can be a huge boost to their effectiveness as well as to their mobility, basically guaranteeing that they're able to win engagements with enemy infantry. In the air, the Vork gunship has a powerful long-range particle beam, able to take out most heavy vehicles and even turbo laser emplacements from afar, or to raid enemy bases and take out smaller structures, while also being able to quickly transport 2 squads of infantry to new areas. Second is the Solanas Speeder, a nimble anti-vehicle craft able to quickly move around the battlefield, raiding vehicles or turrets, but not anti-air turrets. Don't use your air speeders against anti-air turrets unless you really just don't like them. Now that we've covered the rosters for ground and space as well as the government mechanics, we'll finish up with a few tips on how to start off your galactic conquests. As with all prior tips here, my goal with these guides isn't to be the be-all and end-all of master strategy, especially for a faction that's new and hasn't had time for the player base to find even more efficient ways to play. It's instead to be just some basic rules of thumb to make everything more approachable, so don't feel like you're locked into just playing how I say here. The Hapans are currently only playable in some of the progressive maps and from the ground up, so we'll be focusing on the small known galaxy progressive map for these tips. As we covered earlier in the video, the Hapans have some very strong defenses, most of which are built up at the start of the game on their home planets, along with a good amount of starting forces. Their neighbors have a few very powerful fleets, so you may find yourself attacked by pretty big Imperial forces early on, including some Super Star Destroyers from Warlord's Inge. As a defensive faction, you'll want to build a few probes to scout out enemy planets and choose when you'll attack carefully. Pick targets to expand to, which will allow you to build up more defenses, and try to mainly engage these large fleets or Super Star Destroyers on your own built-up planets, before expanding out into weakened enemy territory. Because of how close your planets are to each other compared to outside worlds, if you keep a main home defense fleet on one of your internal planets like Hapes, when a border planet like Relafon is attacked, you'll usually be able to get your own supportive fleet in before the enemy fleet arrives. If that includes a coronal, for example, you can trap and then annihilate even large Super Star Destroyers or enemy fleets on a planet with even a pair of Meridian 3 or 4 stations, let alone if you can take them on with the even more powerful Aphelion station. Once you have some spare resources, if you can keep even 50 to 100 units of PopCap on planets that limit access to your worlds as your defensive choke points, you can ward off most attacks and focus on different theaters. Basically, you'll want to play around periods of quick expansion, keep your fleets planted while you build up new defensive stations at those new choke points, and then strike out to the next place you plan to use as a choke point, whittling down each enemy as you go, and trying to leave avenues for each other remaining faction to attack each other as well. That's going to do it for our Hapan basic guide. I hope you find these tips helpful whether you're playing as or against the faction. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe for more of the guides as they're made. Thank you for watching, and hope you're enjoying the mod.